So, before we get into tonight's story, just take a moment to get yourself comfortable. You can turn the lights down a little, or off completely, if that feels better. Maybe adjust the room slightly so it's not too warm, not too cold, just enough so you don't really notice it anymore. And just let your body settle. Your shoulders, your hands, your breathing. There's nothing you need to hold on to right now. You don't have to follow every part of the story. Just listen and let it drift when it does. That's enough. And before we begin, I'm always a bit curious. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it for you? If you feel like sharing, you can leave it in the comments. And if you end up enjoying this kind of quiet space, you can leave a like or subscribe, just so it's here the next time you need it. Break time equal 5s. No pressure. Let's begin. Story 1. Uwolden Serviv. Monk the gate was iron-banded oak, old enough that the grain had gone silver. Frost had settled into the wood overnight, outlining each plank in white. History didn't happen the way they taught you. It happened in silence, in rooms no one remembers, by hands no one wrote about. 1147. Oxfordshire, England. Wood smoke and wet stone and the last of the morning mist, lying in the courtyard like something reluctant to leave. He had walked from the village before first light. 3 miles of frozen ruts that found every fault in the leather of his boots. By the time the monastery wall appeared through the bare trees, cold had moved past the surface and settled somewhere deeper, the kind that makes the bones feel thin. He stopped at the gate. He did not knock. Break time equal 05s. The bundle on his back held everything. 2 wool tunics, his father's psalter, small enough to fit in a palm. A piece of hard cheese his mother had pressed into his hands at the threshold that morning. Without speaking, her eyes already somewhere ahead of him, or perhaps further back. The porter opened the gate before the boy's hand could rise. Not welcome, not warmth. The practiced movement of a man who had opened this gate many hundreds of times, and had learned that hesitation before a monastery door was itself a form of prayer. That what a person did in the moment before entering said more than anything they might say afterward. He was wide and deliberate, with a face that had long ago decided to remain unmoved. He looked at the boy with the flat accuracy of someone who kept a long memory for arrivals. Then he stepped aside. Break time EL5s. The boy walked through. The courtyard was not what he had imagined. He had imagined something large with God in it, visible in stone. What he found was a place shaped entirely by use. Flagstones worn smooth along certain paths, rough everywhere else. A well at the center, its rope dark with years of handling. A low cloister on 3 sides, each arch the same width as the last. As if uniformity were itself a kind of devotion. Not grandeur. Precision. The wind stopped here. Inside the walls, the air held a different quality. Stiller, without the countryside's push. What replaced it was smell. Damp wool and tallow smoke and beeswax. And something underneath all of it that had no single name. Something the boy would spend weeks trying to identify before understanding it was simply time itself. Break time .05s absorbed into the stone over 100 years of the same days. He stood by the well. He waited. A crow called once from the church tower and did not call again. Water dripped somewhere behind a closed door, patient as the place itself. 2 monks crossed the far end of the cloister, one behind the other, moving with the particular quality of people who had long ago ceased to distinguish between walking and praying, for whom one was simply the body's version of the other. They did not look at the boy. They turned a corner and disappeared. The novice master arrived without announcement. He was perhaps 50, with a face whose age had stopped mattering to its expression. It had settled into patient, break, time 05s, absolute attention. The kind that comes from decades, spent watching what happens when people are required to become more than they believed possible. He stopped in front of the boy. He looked at him without judgment, the way a man who has taken many things apart looks at something new. He held out his hand. The boy gave him the bundle, the psalter, the cheese, everything. He did not watch where it went. That evening the choir sang vespers in the stone church. 22 voices in Latin, pressing outward against the walls and finding nowhere to go but deeper into the space, into the body of everyone standing in it. The boy did not understand the words. He would not for months, but the sound did something to the place inside his chest where he had been carrying the morning, the road, his mother's silence. It pressed that place flat. Break time 5s, not emptied, rearranged. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. He could not see it through the narrow windows. He could feel it. The way the air in the church shifted slightly, as if the world beyond the walls had quietly made a decision. The gate had closed behind him. He had not heard it. Before the second morning, the novice master placed a small volume on the table in front of the boy. The cover was plain wood, worn pale at the edges. The pages inside were thin and dark with use. A great deal of human handling had made the thing feel almost warm. The Rule of Saint Benedict. 73 chapters. Written 600 years earlier by a man who had understood something about human weakness that most men spend a lifetime refusing to acknowledge. That left to itself, break time 5s. The self will always choose comfort over truth, and that this choice, repeated daily, will eventually make a person very small. Most people, hearing about the monastery's structure for the first time, assumed it was punishment. The waking at night, the fasting, the silence, the absolute obedience. They heard these things and thought of suffering imposed from outside, the way weather or debt arrives from outside. This is not what you think. The rule was not built to break men. It was built the way a forge is built, not to destroy iron, but to make it capable of holding an edge. The day was divided into 8 offices. Matins at 2 in the morning, lauds at dawn, prime at 6, terce at 9, sext at noon, none at 3 in the afternoon, vespers at sunset, compline before bed. Between the offices, work, reading, study. Break time 05s. The bell governed everything. Its sound was the spine of every day, and the day itself was the spine of every year. And the years accumulated in a man's body like rings in a tree, each one the same in shape, each one slightly thicker than the last. The boy read the Latin slowly. He had been taught enough to follow it, but not enough to move through it quickly, and so each line arrived with a deliberateness that a more fluent reader would have missed. He stopped at chapter 7. The chapter on humility. He read it twice. His hands rested flat on the table. The smell of the room was parchment and cold stone, and a faint trace of incense from the chapel next door. Not strong, just present, the way certain facts are present without announcing themselves. The novice master sat across from him, but did not watch him read. Break time 5s. He was mending a leather strap with the unhurried competence of someone for whom no task was beneath attention. The awl moved through the leather with a soft, regular sound. In and through, in and through. The boy became aware of this sound only after several minutes, which meant his own breathing had slowed to match it. He turned another page. The chapter on obedience. Not blind obedience. The rule was careful about this, more careful than the boy had expected. The abbot was to be obeyed. Yes, but the abbot was also bound to listen. to consult, to govern not through fear but through teaching. The structure was mutual. 2 walls holding the same arch. He read until the bell rang for tercy. He closed the book and placed both palms on its cover for a moment. Before rising, break, time 05s. The way you place your hands on a surface to feel whether it is warm or cold. It was neither. It was simply there, dense with purpose, worn by 100 pairs of hands before his, and perfectly indifferent to whether he understood it yet. He would understand it. Not for many months, and not all at once, and not the way he had understood things before, with the part of the mind that processes information. He would understand it the way the stone in the courtyard understood rain. From the outside in, over a very long time, until the shape of the thing was part of the shape of him. He rose for tercy with the others, his voice joining theirs before he had consciously decided to sing. That was the first thing the monastery asked of him. Not belief, not certainty, break time meekly 05s. Only the willingness to let the structure carry him while he learned what it was for. Outside, snow lay along the cloister walls and in the hollows of the courtyard flagstones. It was very white against the dark stone, very still, the kind of stillness that has weight to it, not empty, but full of something that had not decided yet what to become. He had been here one night. The rule had 73 chapters. He had read through chapter 8 at Compline after the last prayer, and before the first step toward the dormitory. The monastery became a different place, not quieter. It had been quiet all day, in the particular way of places where silence is governed rather than merely absent. But after Compline, the quality of the silence changed. It became the great silence, and the great silence had rules of its own. Break time 5s. No speech until after prime the next morning. Nothing except what was absolutely necessary, and even that only through the limited vocabulary of approved signs. The boy had been told about this before he arrived. He had thought he understood it. He had not. Human speech, when you have always had it, is invisible. It is like the weight of air, present constantly, unfelt, noticed only when it stops. The boy did not notice its weight until the morning of the 3rd day, when he opened his mouth out of habit to say something to the monk working beside him at the kitchen table, and caught himself. The monk did not look up. He continued peeling turnips with the steady, practiced movement of someone who had long ago stopped expecting conversation. The boy closed his mouth. The sound he had not made hung somewhere near his lips. Break time .05s, still shaped for speech, going nowhere. This was the first real difficulty. Not the cold, not the early waking, not the hard bed, the silence. Because silence was not merely the absence of sound. It was the absence of the principal way he had navigated the world since he could talk. Name a thing and you own it, or at least locate it. Stop naming things and they become larger, stranger, more themselves. The kitchen smelled of turnip and wood smoke and the wet cloth they used to wipe down the tables. The knife made a soft sound against the board. Below that, the sound of fire in the hearth, settling into itself. Below that, the breathing of the 2 monks at the far end of the room, moving in rhythm with their work, as synchronized as men who have shared a workspace for years without noticing it. The boy learned to listen instead of speak. Break time 05s. Not passively, with effort, the way you strain to hear something distant. He learned to hear the difference between the bell struck for tercy and the bell struck for sext, which were the same bell, but at different temperatures and therefore produced slightly different resonances in the stone. He learned to read the sound of footsteps in the cloister, which monk was passing, whether they were early or late, whether something was wrong. He learned that silence between two people who are working well together is a form of conversation, that it has a texture, and the texture changes when one of them is troubled. One afternoon in the 4th week, he was copying in the scriptorium. The work required a particular quality of attention, total focus on the letter being formed, combined with a continuous awareness of the line, the page, break time. 5s, the parchment's resistance to the pen. The room held 6 monks, all copying, none speaking. The only sounds were the scratch of pens and the occasional turn of a page. The monk beside him, an older man with a scar along the jaw, paused in his work and looked up. Not at anything particular, just up. A small, involuntary pause, the kind that happens when something in the mind shifts. Then he looked at the boy directly, and in his expression was something that took the boy a moment to read. Not sympathy, exactly. Recognition. He had seen this before, this particular moment, in this particular kind of young man, at approximately this point in the adjustment. He looked at the boy as if to say, yes, and it passes. Then he looked back at his page and resumed. No words. The message was complete. The boy looked at his own page. Break time, Eve, all 5s. The letter he had been forming was slightly crooked, the hesitation in his hand visible in the ink. He would have to go back. He went back. That was the week he stopped reaching for words when he didn't have them, and started letting the silence answer instead. It didn't always, but sometimes, in the space where speech would have been, something else arrived. Something that had apparently been waiting for the room to clear. The bell rang for sext. He capped the ink. He rose. The great silence would resume after Compline. It always did. And in the morning, before prime, there was an hour when it was still operating. And in that hour, the monastery was as close to itself as it ever got. Stripped of everything that wasn't essential. Nothing left but stone and cold air, and the sound of 40 men breathing their way toward another day. Break time, 05s. He had started to look forward to that hour. The bell for Matins rang at 2 in the morning, not approximately 2. Not after 2, not approaching 2. Precisely 2. Governed by a water clock in the sacristy that had been keeping the same time for 40 years. Tended by the same succession of monks who had dedicated their attention to the task of keeping the monastery's hours exact. 2 in the morning was Matins, and Matins was non-negotiable, and the only difference between winter and summer was that in winter, the darkness between the bell and the church felt physical, a density in the air that the body had to push through. The boy had been sleeping for perhaps 4 hours when the bell began. He did not wake the way he had woken at home. Gradually, Webrake, time, 05s, with the morning light coming in and the sounds of the farm beginning and time to lie a moment longer before rising. He woke the way the bell demanded, immediately, with his feet on the cold stone floor before the second ring had finished, because that was what was required, and the dormitory held 30 other men doing the same thing, and the sound of 30 men rising in unison in the dark is its own kind of compulsion. The dormitory was a long room above the cloister. No fire. No light except the small lamp at the far end kept burning through the night, its flame low enough to be navigation rather than illumination, a point to move toward, nothing more. The beds were straw pallets on wooden frames, 1 per monk, arranged in a single row along each wall. The rule required sleeping in one's habit, break time 05s, which meant each man rose already dressed, or almost dressed, just the shoes, the belt, the hood pulled up against a cold that at this hour felt permanent, as if the world had decided overnight to stop warming. The boy reached for his shoes in the dark and found them. He could hear, across the narrow space between beds, the low sounds of the dormitory waking, a suppressed cough, the creak of wood, the shuffle of feet across stone. No speaking. The great silence was still in operation. Even in the dark, even at this hour, no speaking. He stood, adjusted his belt, pulled his hood forward. His breath came out white and hung in the still air for a moment before disappearing. The cold had a texture at this hour, not sharp, the way cold is sharp when you step outside, but deep, break, time, 05s. The kind that had been accumulating in the stone walls all night and radiated inward now, steady as a tide. He joined the line, moving toward the church. The procession from dormitory to church was perhaps 40 steps through the cloister. 40 steps in darkness, single file, no light to spare. The flagstones were ice smooth at the edges, where 1,000 winters of foot traffic had worn them. Somewhere in the middle of the line, a monk stumbled, just slightly, a small misstep, a boot catching the edge of a stone. The man directly behind him caught his arm, without looking, without hesitation, a movement so practiced it had become reflex. Two bodies in the dark, one steadying the other. The line continued without pause. The church was colder than the dormitory, which was colder than the outdoors had been. Break time 05s, and the outdoors was below freezing. This was a specific paradox of stone buildings in England in winter that no one who hadn't lived it could quite prepare for. The stone absorbed cold the way it absorbed everything, completely, over a long time, releasing it slowly, and without regard for what was preferred. They took their places in the choir. The cantor lifted his voice for the opening versicle, and the rest answered, and then the psalms began. The long cadenced cycle of the divine office. 150 psalms distributed across the week, sung in a key that the building had been designed to hold. The voices moved through the space, and the space moved them back, altered, resonant. The sound of each voice larger inside the church than it would have been anywhere else. The boy sang. Break time 05s. He did not always know the words. He was still learning, and in the dark some pages blurred. He sang the syllables he knew and let the rest move through him. The cold pressed in from outside, and the voices pushed back, and between these two pressures the body stayed warm enough to continue. An hour. Sometimes longer, when the office included additional responses. Then back to the dormitory for what remained of the night. He lay down on the pallet. His feet were cold despite the shoes. His voice was slightly raw. The lamp at the end of the dormitory still burned its small, patient flame. He would sleep for 2 hours, perhaps 3. Then the bell for lauds. Then the day. By the end of January, he stopped thinking of the cold as a condition and started thinking of it as an entity. This was not mysticism. Break time sil al 5s. It was simple familiarity. The way you become familiar with anything that shares your space constantly, that is present when you wake, and present when you sleep, and present in everything you touch. Every breath you draw, every surface your hands make contact with. Cold was the first thing the monastery gave him each morning. It was the last thing present each night. It had settled into the flagstones and the walls and the choir stalls and the water in the well and the pallet on the wooden frame, and it did not leave between seasons so much as retreat. Pull back to the deep stone, wait for autumn, return. The dormitory at night was the cold at its most complete. There was no fire. The rule did not permit it except in the warming room, which was available for a single hour each day, and only for the oldest and the ill. Break time 05s. Everyone else slept in the habit they had worn all day, under a wool blanket. that had been washed so many times it had felted slightly along the edges, stiff where it had dried against the frame, soft in the center where it had been held. The boy learned to curl on his side with his knees toward his chest, his arms folded across his ribs, creating the smallest possible surface for the cold to find. The body, given enough nights, became very efficient at this. It stopped wasting heat. The cold was not merely temperature. It had texture. In the dormitory, it was dry and still, the kind that settles into bone like it intends to stay. The kind that by February had found the boy's left shoulder, where an old fall had left a weakness, and lived there. Outside, after lauds with the wind moving over the fields, break time 05s, it had a different quality entirely. It had direction, intention, a particular malice for the gap between hood and collar, the thin skin of the wrist, the exposed ankle above a boot that did not quite reach. He learned to move through it rather than resist it. Resistance was the wrong approach. Tensing against cold does not warm the body. It only exhausts it. What worked was movement, even small movement. What worked was the rhythm of the office, the sustained singing that kept the chest working steadily, kept the breath moving in and out with enough force that the body generated its own small warmth. What worked was labor, break time equals.
05s.
Which came after terse, the kitchen work, or field work, or craft work, that the rule scheduled precisely because the monks who had built this system had understood that the body left idle in the cold would eventually stop caring about much of anything. One morning in February, after the night office, he could not feel his feet by the time he reached the church. He had felt this before, the particular transition from cold painful to cold numb, which felt like relief but was not. He sang through Matins standing on feet he could not locate. Afterward, in the 5 minutes before the signal to return to the dormitory, he stopped beside the wall nearest the small lamp and stood there. The old monk he had seen in the scriptorium, the one with the scar, came to stand near him. Not beside him, exactly. Break time 0.5s. Close enough that the warmth of another body was faintly present, the way a candle is present in a large room. Not enough to change the temperature, but enough to know it is there. He did not speak. He did not look at the boy. He stood for 2 minutes, perhaps 3, and then moved on. One warm thing. In a life of cold, that was not nothing. The boy looked at the wall. The stone was gray-brown in the lamplight, sweating slightly with the difference between the air's temperature and the stone's temperature. Somewhere in it, a crack ran from floor to waist height, not new, the edges worn smooth, the crack's interior dark. Something had grown in it, some small, persistent plant, pressing outward from the stone's interior toward the lamp. He watched it for a moment. Break time equal 5s. Then he went back to the dormitory and lay down on the pallet and tucked his hands under his arms and waited for the cold to become familiar again, which it always did, because familiarity was the one mercy available here. And the stone withheld nothing else. The rule was precise about work, not specific. It did not prescribe what kind, for what duration, under what conditions. It was precise about the principle. Labor was not punishment for existing, and it was not merely necessary for the monastery's survival, though it was both of those things. It was the third pillar of the day, equal in weight to prayer and study. And the man who worked well worked as carefully as the man who prayed well, which meant with his full attention, without resentment, without hurry. The boy was assigned to the kitchen first. Break time, 5s. This was standard for novices. Kitchen work was the most immediate, the most physically straightforward, the least forgiving of inattention. He peeled roots and carried water and scrubbed the large iron pot with river sand, which took the skin off the knuckles slowly and completely over a period of weeks, leaving them red and cracked in a way that would not fully heal until spring. He chopped the kind of hard winter vegetables that require the whole arm, not just the wrist. He carried heavy things short distances many times a day until the weight of the load ceased to be a problem and became simply what the body did in the morning. In March, they moved him to the fields. The monastery's land ran east and north of the church. Break time .05s, divided into strips that had been plowed and rested and plowed again in the same rotation since before anyone currently living had joined the community. The work in early spring was breaking clods, turning the frost-heaved soil back into something that would accept seed. This was work for the whole body, the spade's weight, the resistance of compacted earth, the rhythm that had to be maintained over hours if the back was going to survive the day. The boy learned the rhythm within a week. He learned it the way the body learns anything physical, through repetition, through small failures, through adjustments made without conscious decision. He worked beside a monk known in the records only as the gardener, a lean man past 60, who moved through the work with an economy that the boy spent months trying to understand. Break time 05s. He used exactly as much effort as required and not one fraction more. When the spade went in, it went in at the precise angle that would loosen the most soil with the least resistance. When he turned the clod, it broke exactly where it needed to break. No wasted motion, no drama, just the quiet accumulation of correct, unremarkable action. They worked without speaking, because it was before Terci and the great silence was still in operation. They worked in the particular companionship of two people doing the same thing at the same pace in the same direction. The kind of wordless coordination that emerges not from agreement, but from shared attention to the work itself. The earth smelled of cold mud and old roots, and something mineral and ancient underneath. Break time. 05s. The deep smell of ground that has been worked for 100 years and remembers every season. One afternoon, the boy's spade struck something. Not stone, something different. He stopped. He knelt and worked with his hands, brushing soil aside. A piece of tile, flat, red, handmade, the surface slightly ridged, where a thumb had pressed it centuries earlier in the clay before firing. Roman, probably. This valley had been Roman once. The monastery sat on the bones of something older than itself. The gardener paused in his work and looked. He said nothing. He returned to the work. The boy held the tile for a moment. He turned it over. The underside was clean, the way buried things are clean. No weather, no light, just the constant and impersonal compression of earth. He could feel the ridge of that ancient thumb in the clay. Break time 05s. He set the tile aside at the field's edge and went back to work. He would think of it sometimes, in the years that followed. Not often, and never for long. Just occasionally. In the way certain small things return. A piece of the world pressing its way into the present from a very long distance, asking to be held for a moment, and then released. The spade went in. The soil turned. The afternoon light moved across the field without hurrying, the way light in England in March moves, low and clear and without warmth yet, illuminating everything without changing any of it. The bell rang for none. The gardener straightened. He brushed his hands against his habit. He looked at the field, assessed the portion completed, looked at the portion remaining. Then he turned and walked back toward the cloister. The boy followed. Break time 05s. His hands were cold, and his shoulders ached, and the smell of the earth was in his clothes, would remain there. until washing day. He had not thought about his life before the monastery since the 3rd week. On feast days there was fish, and on ordinary days there was not. On Wednesdays and Fridays there was no meat, no eggs, no dairy, 2 meals of bread and legumes, and whatever root vegetables the kitchen had managed to prepare, taken in silence in the refectory, while one monk read aloud from the rule or from scripture, his voice the only sound in a room of 30 men eating. On the days before major feasts, a full fast, 1 meal, taken after none, bread and water and nothing else. The boy had been hungry before, the ordinary hunger of a boy who worked outdoors and grew faster than the household could comfortably feed. Break time 05s. But that hunger had always been temporary, always a few hours from its resolution. This was different. This was institutional, structural, built into the week with the same care that the hours of prayer were built in, because the abbot who had organized this particular community had understood what the tradition taught, that the body's hunger is the mind's greatest rival for attention, and that learning to sit with hunger without surrendering to it is the same skill as learning to sit with doubt, with grief, with the kind of spiritual dryness that comes to every monk, eventually, when prayer stops feeling like anything at all. On the 3rd fast day, the boy could not eat his 1 allotted portion, not because he wasn't hungry. Break time equals 05s, because his stomach had contracted so fully over the preceding hours that the bread tasted of something strange, the taste of a body that has been asleep to its own appetite for too long, and now does not know quite how to receive. He ate half. He set the rest down. He looked at it. Across the table, 2 monks ate without particular expression, their attention on the reader's voice. They ate the bread with the same quality of attention they brought to the psalms. Complete, unhurried, without complaint or enthusiasm. As if the food were simply another form of the day's content, neither a reward nor an ordeal. The boy wrapped his remaining bread in his sleeve. He would eat it later, in the dormitory, when no one was watching. He did not eat it. He lay on the pallet that night with the bread inside his habit and did not eat it, a break time E.05s, because by the time he was horizontal in the dark, the hunger had moved past its acute phase and become a kind of diffuse clarity, the particular mental state that comes after sustained fasting. When the body stops demanding and the mind, no longer diverted by appetite, becomes unusually attentive to everything else. The flame of the dormitory lamp was precise and steady. The breathing of the monks around him was distinct, each slightly different, and he could have identified several of them by breath alone. The wool of the blanket against his jaw had a texture he had never noticed before. He lay still. He felt the bread inside his habit and did not eat it. In the morning, he put it back on the refectory table. He didn't know why. He didn't think about why. Break time 05s. He simply placed it on the table at breakfast and returned to his seat and ate his regular portion with the same quality of attention he had watched the others use, which was not indifference, but something more precise than that. A way of receiving what was given without either clinging to it or mourning what was not there. He would be hungry again tomorrow, not despite the rule, but because of it. Because the rule had understood something about the relationship between hunger and attention that took a very long time to understand from the inside. That what the body goes without, the spirit sometimes begins, very slowly, to reach toward. He was not certain he believed this, not fully, not yet, but the bread on the table had seemed right to return. Outside, the spring was beginning, cold and tentative, break times 05s. The kind of spring that arrives in England Not with warmth, but with a slight decrease in rain, with mud that begins to dry at its edges instead of spreading. The fields smelled different in the morning, not the deep winter smell of frozen ground, but something lighter, the suggestion of what the earth was about to do. He ate his breakfast. The reader's voice moved through the room, steady as water. He was not thinking about the bread anymore. He was listening. A year passed. Then another. Then several more. Until the counting stopped mattering, and what remained was simply the life. He was still there. He had become harder to describe than the boy who had stood at the gate. Not because he was more complicated. In some ways, he was simpler. The way tools become simpler when they are used correctly over time. Fewer unnecessary parts. Break time 05s. The essential shape more visible. His hands had the permanent roughness of outdoor work. His voice had settled into the lower register that years of choir singing produce, a resonance that belonged to the stone building as much as it belonged to him. He slept easily, rose without difficulty, worked without resentment. The cold in the dormitory was as cold as it had always been. He did not think about it. One autumn evening, after Compline, he stood in the cloister for a moment before going to the dormitory. This was not unusual. The cloister in the minutes after Compline held a quality that was difficult to name, something between silence and presence, the air carrying the residue of the last prayer before the great silence descended for the night. He stood with his hands loose at his sides. He was not praying. He was not thinking. Break time .05s. He was simply there, in the way a person is sometimes simply there, not because they have arrived at some destination, but because the need to be anywhere other than where they are has, for the moment, gone quiet. The sky above the cloister was dark and very clear. Cold stars, the smell of wood smoke and the last grass before autumn ended. A dog somewhere beyond the wall, barking twice and then stopping. Somewhere deeper in the monastery, a door closed with the careful sound of a man trying not to wake anyone. He looked at the cloister arch nearest to him. The stone was limestone, pale gray, worn slightly at the impost, where generations of hands had rested when standing in this exact spot. His own hands had rested there many times. He did not reach for it now. Break time =5s. He simply looked at the wear in the stone and understood it as a kind of language, the accumulated record of every person who had stood here and felt what he was feeling now, which was not joy exactly, and not peace exactly, but something that contained both and was perhaps what both pointed toward. The monastery had not made him into someone he was not. It had not replaced the boy who arrived at the gate with a different person wearing the same face. Distant isn't measured in years. It is measured in what the years have asked of you, what the monastery had asked, the cold, the hunger, the silence, the 2 in the morning rising, the decades of the same psalms sung in the same stone building, in the same sequence. Was not that he become less than he was. It was that he become less distracted. Break time 05s, less occupied by things that dissolved on examination. More available to whatever was actually present, in each day, in each hour, in the small, irreducible facts of an ordinary morning. The bread on the table, the creak of the choir stalls, the specific sound of the bell at sext on a clear winter afternoon, the weight of a psalter in the hand. A wonder made of repetition holds a kind of secret. The secret is that it was never the repetition that mattered. It was the attention. Let this monastery come with you into the dark tonight. You don't need to understand it. Just feel its cold stone, its old bell, the weight of its silence. That monastery still stands, or the ruins of one like it still stand, at the edge of fields that have been plowed 1,000 times since. The stone holds the cold of 800 winters. Break time 05s. If you put your hand against it on a November night, it gives back nothing. It keeps everything. The monk's nights were not unusual for his world. Every person in medieval England knew the dark differently from how we know it now. Not as an interval between days, not as something to be crossed as quickly as sleep allows, but as a territory, a place with its own geography, its own hours, its own particular demands on the body and the mind. They slept differently. They woke differently. The night, for them, was two things, divided by an hour that belonged to no one. Scory 2. What medieval slept? Like there is a word that no longer exists in common English, although it existed for centuries. Doctors used it, priests used it, poets used it, writers on sleep used it as naturally as we might refer to morning or afternoon. Break time 0.5s, because for them it described something as ordinary as either. The word was first sleep, and the assumption inside it was this: there would be two. Medieval people did not expect to sleep through the night. The idea of a single unbroken stretch of sleep from dark to dawn. The idea that waking in the middle of the night constitutes failure, disruption, a symptom of something wrong, is a modern invention. Recent enough that many of the grandparents of people alive today lived in its shadow without recognizing that it had not always been so. Before artificial light changed the evening, before the gaslight of the 19th century pushed the darkness back another 2 hours, and the electric light pushed it further, still human beings slept in two periods, not by discipline, not by accident, as a matter of simple biology. Break time 05s. First sleep began at nightfall. In winter, this was 4 or 5 in the afternoon. In summer, somewhat later, but always shortly after dark fell and the last light left the air. The body, deprived of sun, began the long descent towards sleep that it had been built to begin, not slowly, not reluctantly, but with the deep cooperative ease of a mechanism doing what it was made for. Sleep came quickly, fully. The body gave itself to it without the negotiation that modern insomnia requires. First sleep lasted approximately 4 hours. Then the body woke. This was not distress. The documents are clear about this. In the way, only documents are clear when they describe something so ordinary that it requires no explanation. Break time 5s. A man writing in the 12th century did not explain why he woke between his sleeps any more than he would explain why he was hungry at noon. He woke. He lay in the dark. He did what he did during the waking hour. Then he slept again. In the monastery, this waking hour was formalized into the night office. Matins at 2. The bell organized something that would have happened anyway, channeling the body's natural waking into communal prayer, which was perhaps the most efficient arrangement possible. 30 men who were going to be awake regardless, all awake at the same time, all occupied with the same purpose. Outside the monastery, in the villages and towns, the waking hour was less structured. A man might lie in the dark beside his wife and speak to her in a way he did not during the day. Without the pressure of daylight, break time 05s, without the visibility of faces, in the particular honesty that darkness permits. A woman might rise and tend to a child or a sick animal, or simply sit near the embers for a time, thinking thoughts that the daylight hours did not leave room for. They were not waiting for morning. They were living in the interval, awake in the dark, unhurried, inside a natural pause that the body had always provided and that the modern world has closed. Second sleep followed. Deeper than first, often, and sometimes laced with the vivid dreaming that attends the later phases of the night. It lasted until dawn or until the rooster, or until the bell, whichever came first. This was the architecture of medieval night. 2 rooms connected by a waking hour. Not a problem to be solved. A structure to be inhabited. Break time 05s. The boy who became a monk inhabited it for decades. So did the blacksmith in the next village, who woke each night and lay in the smell of his own forge. Coal and iron and hot metal, cooled to room temperature, still present in the timbers of the building, absorbed over years of fire. So did the miller's wife, who sometimes woke and went to the window to check the weather, pressing her face against the oiled cloth that let in no light, but admitted the cold in thin, precise threads. So did the parish priest in his stone house beside the church, lying in the dark and listening to his own silence, going over the day's duties in his mind the way you go over a path you will walk again tomorrow. All of them woke. All of them lay in the dark. None of them called it insomnia. No one in medieval England slept alone if they could help it. Break time 05s. This was not sentiment. It was not even custom, particularly. It was a rational response to cold, to darkness, and to the understanding, accurate then and still accurate now, that a body beside another body will be warmer than either body alone. And that warmth in a world without central heating was among the most immediate goods available to any person of any class, in any season, in any type of dwelling from castle to cottage to monastery. The monastery dormitory was the formal version of what happened informally in every household across the country. In the farmer's house, the family slept in one room, sometimes one bed. Adults and children layered in the straw, with the household animals on the other side of a low partition, their body heat contributing to the building's temperature in a way that was not incidental but deliberate. Break time 05s. The arrangement was old, older than the monastery, older than the village, older than the written language in which these sleeping arrangements were later recorded. In the dormitory, the monks slept in a single row on each side, the pallets close enough that the sound of the man beside you was present all night. Not intrusive, familiar, the way the breathing of a room sounds when you have shared it long enough that it becomes background, ambient, a texture of the night rather than a disturbance. The monks slept in their habits. Every account agrees on this. Not from piety alone, though piety was part of it. The rule specified that a monk should be ready to rise at the bell without delay, which meant already dressed, already equipped for the cold transit from dormitory to church. But there was also the simple fact of warmth. Break time 05s. A wool habit worn all day carries body heat into the night. It smells of the day's work, bread and earth and tallow smoke, and the particular human warmth of a person who has prayed and labored and sung. And this smell, by the time first sleep arrived, had become the smell of safety. The straw in the pallets was replaced twice yearly and smelled for the first weeks of the field it had come from. A dry, clean smell of cut grass and summer sun that felt incongruous in a dormitory in November, but was not unwelcome. The wool blankets were rough at the edges and soft in the center, where they had been used longest. The wooden frames made sounds in the night, adjusting to the temperature, small creaks and settlings that anyone who slept in such a room for long enough stopped hearing. One winter night, deep in the coldest weeks of February, a break. 05s. A monk on the far side of the room began coughing. The wet, difficult cough of someone moving toward lung sickness, which was the monastery's most consistent winter visitor, its most reliable killer of the old and the weak. He coughed for several minutes. No one rose. No one spoke. The great silence was in operation, and the dormitory was no exception. But in the darkness, as the coughing continued, the monk on the nearest pallet shifted, just slightly, a few inches, pressing his back against the edge of the coughing man's frame. The small transfer of warmth from one body to another, through wood and wool and darkness. The coughing slowed. He would be sick for 3 weeks and would recover. The monks who cared for him in the infirmary would say later that he had turned the corner earlier than expected. They did not record why. No words. Break time 05s. No explanation. One body recognizing another's need in the dark and moving toward it without ceremony. Morning came eventually, as it always did, not with warmth, not in February, but with a gray and gradual lifting of the dark that was its own form of answer. The dormitory lamp, which had burned its careful flame all night, became less visible as the light through the high slit windows increased. The room resolved from darkness into its familiar shape. The row of pallets, the row of sleeping forms, the stone wall with its perpetual cold, the smell of wool and breath, and the residue of 100 recent nights still present in the air. The bell rang. 30 bodies stirred. Medieval England at 2 in the morning was not silent. Break time 05s. This is one of those facts that arrives with the quiet force of the obvious. A world without electricity was not therefore a quiet world. It was a world without electric sound, which is a different and narrower category. What remained was everything that makes sound without electricity, and that is a great deal. The church bell first. Always the church bell, which in England rang every 3 hours, or every hour in some parishes, or on the quarter hour in towns large enough to afford the cantor's time, and whose sound traveled a surprising distance through cold night air, further than a man could shout, further than a horse would normally carry him before dawn. The bell located you in the night. It confirmed that the village still existed, that the church was still standing, brick time 05s, that someone had pulled the rope at the prescribed time, and the sequence was continuing, not just timekeeping. Continuity beyond the bell, dogs. Dogs in a medieval village were not pets in the modern sense. They were working animals. They slept outside or in the barn. They responded to every unfamiliar sound with the professional thoroughness of creatures that understood their function. A single dog barking would set off 3 others, and 3 others would set off 6. And for a few minutes the night would be layered with this sound, moving from farm to farm across the countryside until it subsided. Then silence. Then a single dog, far off, unconvinced, whined through the gap in the shutter. This was a specific sound, not generic. The precise pitch and rhythm of air moving through a particular imperfection in a particular shutter. Break time 05s, which varied by season and by the shutter's age and by how carefully it had been fitted when built. The people who slept behind that shutter knew it exactly, had heard it for years, heard it in their sleep without waking, heard it the way you hear your own heartbeat, always present, rarely attended to, immediately noticeable when it stops. Fire. In houses where the central hearth burned through the night, fire made continuous small sounds, the collapse of an ember, the hiss of green wood releasing moisture, the occasional sharp report of a knot splitting in the heat. The people sleeping nearest the fire were warm and heard it close. The people furthest away were cold and heard it diminished. Both heard it. Both slept to it. Rain on thatch was a different kind of sound, pervasive, blurring everything else. Break time 05s, creating the particular pressure of sustained white noise that pushed the mind not toward alertness but toward depth. Rain was good for sleeping, when the house was sound and nothing was leaking. It was less good when a section of thatch had given way, and the cold came in not as a draught, but as a thin, steady stream that found the face with unerring precision inside the dormitory, breathing. 30 men breathing in different phases of sleep, each slightly out of sync with the others, so the room's collective breath was not one sound, but a layered texture, some fast, some slow, one snoring in the low register that vibrated slightly in the chest of anyone lying near it. Beneath all of it, the stone building itself, which made sounds in the cold as it contracted, small, irregular geological sounds, break, time, 05s, passes if the building were adjusting its position in the earth. A drop of water from the roof gutter fell into the drain below, with a sound like a single note, struck once and not repeated. A drop of water sounded like the castle was counting seconds. The boy who had become a monk lay in his pallet after Matins returned to the dormitory, still slightly cold from the church. He lay and listened to the room. He had learned to do this, not from instruction, but from the natural consequence of having spent enough hours in required silence that the ear had become more capable than it had been before. He could hear which monk was awake beside him by the quality of the breathing. He could hear the wind in the church tower, which was different from the wind in the cloister, which was different from the wind across the open fields. He could hear break time .05s. If the night was still enough, the sound of the river 3/4 of a mile to the south, all of it was present. All of it was simply the night. He closed his eyes. The sounds continued, as they always did. The body has a strategy for cold. It is not a complex strategy. It is very old, encoded before language, before consciousness of the kind we call consciousness. The same strategy used by every warm-blooded creature that has ever spent a night in a climate that fell below what it prefers. The strategy is pull in, reduce the surface, protect the core, sacrifice the extremities which can tolerate cold to preserve the center which cannot. Medieval sleepers understood this without understanding it. The way you understand any inherited knowledge that comes not as information but as instinct. They slept curled, they slept layered. Break time, 05s. They slept against other bodies, and their bodies against other bodies. And in the morning, the places where two people had pressed together were the warm places, and the uncovered edges were the cold places. And no one required an explanation of either. The wool blanket of the monastery was dense. Not thick, it had been washed too many times for that, but dense in a specific way, the weave tight enough to hold still air within it, which was the only mechanism available. Warmth in a cold room is not warmth from outside the blanket. There is no outside warmth to offer. Warmth under a blanket is warmth from the body itself, trapped. The blanket's function was not to add heat, but to prevent its escape. This it did, imperfectly, with the best available technology, which was wool. The feet were always the problem. Break time 5s. They were furthest from the heart and covered only by the leather boots during waking hours, which were insufficient, and by nothing much during sleeping hours, when the habit was on, but the boots were off. By January, the boy had learned to sleep with his feet tucked against the back of his knees, which put them in contact with the blanket from both sides and kept them marginally warmer than they would have been extended. He had learned this from observation, watching how the older monks positioned themselves after Matins, their bodies carrying decades of optimized adaptation to this specific problem. The cold also shaped the quality of sleep. Cold sleep is lighter sleep in general. The body maintains a degree of vigilance about temperature even in rest, monitoring for the threshold. where discomfort becomes danger. Break time .05s. A person sleeping cold does not descend to the deepest levels of sleep as readily as a person sleeping warm, which means cold sleep is more easily interrupted, more easily populated by the light, surface-level dreams that are easily remembered rather than the deep dreams that leave only an impression by morning. One February night, the boy dreamed he was standing in a warm room. There was no content to the dream beyond warmth. No people, no events, no narrative. Just warmth as a quality of air, as a condition of existence, the way warmth is a condition of existing in summer. He stood in it and felt it on the surface of his skin and on the insides of his lungs. He did not move or speak. He simply stood. He woke to the dormitory cold, and the dream was still present, not fading the way dreams fade, but simply there. Break time .05s. The way a smell is simply there when you walk into a room. He lay still and let it remain for a moment before it dispersed. He pressed his palms together inside the blanket, a small, deliberate warmth, one hand against the other. Outside, the night was very cold and completely dark, the kind that settles into bone like it intends to stay. The kind that, by February, had been settling for 4 months and showed no signs of reconsidering. He did not fight it. He had long since stopped fighting it. The cold was the cold, and the body was the body, and between them was the wool blanket and 40 years of monastic practice, optimized for exactly this moment, this specific cold, this specific body, in this specific room, in an English winter. He was not comfortable. He was not suffering. He was somewhere in the middle distance between the two, break time 05s, which was where most of the medieval world spent its nights, and which was, when he thought about it, simply the honest temperature of being alive in the time and place he had been given. They did not believe dreams came from the sleeping self. This was not naivety. The medieval understanding of dreams was sophisticated in ways that are easy to miss if you approach it assuming the conclusion first. They had read Macrobius, who had organized dream taxonomy in the 4th century into a structure that remained standard for the entire medieval period. There were the dreams that were simply noise, the confused residue of the day's concerns, the body's appetite playing out in images, the overheated mind producing phantoms. These were the dreams of indigestion, of fever, of too much wine. They were not to be trusted. Break time .05s. Then there were the other dreams, the visions and the oracles, the ones that came during the waking hour or in the deep second sleep, the ones that arrived with a quality of clarity and weight that distinguished them, for the dreamer, from mere noise. These were to be taken seriously, which did not mean acted on immediately, which did not mean interpreted literally. The tradition was careful about this, but they were to be held, recorded if possible, brought to someone wiser for examination. In the monastery, Brother Aldrich, the oldest monk, who had been there since the reign of the previous king, kept a small journal that contained nothing but his dreams. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, different from the careful script he used for everything else, as if the recording had to happen quickly before the material dissolved. Break top 5s. He wrote dates, seasons, the state of the weather. He wrote what he had eaten the previous day, what prayers he had said, whether he had been troubled or calm before sleeping, and then the dream itself in Latin, with the particular vocabulary he used for things that defied ordinary description. Not metaphor exactly, but a kind of careful compression of experience that treated language as a container that needed to be handled with care. He had been keeping this journal for 30 years. No one had read it. It was not meant to be read. he said once, in a rare instance of speech on this subject, during an hour when the rule permitted it. It was meant to be remembered. He was the only reader it required. The boy had begun keeping his own notes, not in a journal. He had no journal, but in his memory. Break time equals 05s, which the years of oral recitation had made more reliable than paper. Each morning after Matins, in the brief period before lauds, when the dormitory held the quality of a room between two states, he would find the dream he had had and turn it over in his mind. Not interpret, just hold. One spring morning he dreamed of his mother's hands. Not his mother, just her hands, pressing bread dough against the board, the heel of the palm pushing forward and away in the rhythm he had watched from earliest childhood, the dough yielding and recovering and yielding again under her weight. No face, no context, just the hands and the dough and the smell of the kitchen. On a morning when the door was open and the light came in at a low angle, and everything in the room was visible but not quite real. Break time 05s. The way things are real in dreams, present without being exactly there. He held this dream until after prime. Then he let it go. He did not write it down. He did not speak of it. He ate his breakfast. In the refectory, with the sound of the reader's voice moving through the room, and he tasted the bread, and he thought that the hands in the dream had been perfectly accurate. The exact motion, the exact sound, the resistance of the dough. His body had held the memory of his mother's kitchen with a fidelity that nothing else in his memory had quite matched. He ate the bread. He did not explain this, even to himself. Outside, through the small window, at the end of the refectory, a bird was singing in the courtyard elm. The first bird of the morning, testing the light. Its sound very clear and alone before the others joined it. Break time 05s. In the village, the waking hour between first sleep and second sleep had no name but occupied a known place in the night's structure. The way certain arrangements of furniture occupy a known place in a house. Not discussed, not remarked upon, simply present and accounted for in the body's understanding of the domestic order. Thomas the blacksmith woke most nights at the same hour. He had no clock. He did not need one. His body knew. His wife had once described it as uncanny. The fact that he woke at the same moment each night, without fail, regardless of when he had gone to sleep, as if the night contained a seam, and his body had been calibrated to find it. He had not found this uncanny. He had found it convenient. He would lie still for a few minutes after waking, break time 5s, feeling the heat of the fire on his face. The hearth at the center of the room banked low for the night, its coals still orange under the ash. The room smelled of his forge, iron and coal, and the particular fat and char smell of a fire that had been burning for many years in the same place. He had smelled this his entire life. He would smell it until he died. It was simply the smell of existence. Sometimes he rose and prayed, not the formal office. He was not a monk, and the hours of the divine office were not his to keep. He knew the Pater Noster and the Ave Maria and a handful of psalms in fragmentary Latin, and he would say these in the dark, standing near the fire's warmth. Break time equals 05s. Moving through the familiar words with the particular attention that comes when you are alone in the dark at the hour between your sleeps and have no audience but the fire and whatever else might be listening. Sometimes he and his wife spoke. This was perhaps the most characteristic use of the waking hour for married people. The quiet conversation in the dark that had no equivalent during daylight. Not because anything was hidden, because everything was different. The darkness removed the day's categories of husband and wife, of man who works in the forge, and woman who manages the household. In the dark, at that hour, they were simply two people in the same place, warm from the same fire, in the same body of time. They spoke about small things. They spoke about nothing in particular. Break time 05's they stopped speaking and lay in the silence, and that too was a form of conversation. One night in winter, Thomas's wife woke from first sleep and did not return to second. She lay in the dark for the full waking hour, and then for another hour beyond it, lying still so as not to wake her husband, listening to the dogs outside respond to something moving in the lane, and then quiet again, and the fire settling, and a sound from the loft above. That was the children turning in their sleep. She felt the weight of the blanket. She felt the cold at her back where she had turned away from her husband. She felt the particular tiredness of a body that is awake without wanting to be. Not the clear tiredness of the waking hour, but the dimmer tiredness of the hour after, when the body is confused about what it wants. Break time 05's. She placed her hand on the mud wall beside the bed to feel the warmth left in it from the day's fire. It was still there, faintly, a residue of daytime heat stored in the earth and clay, releasing slowly through the night. She held her palm there for a moment. The warmth was small. In a long winter, that was not nothing. Outside, the village was silent in the way of very cold nights. Every sound compressed, every surface hard and still. The world contracted into the smallest possible version of itself. Waiting, she closed her eyes. Second sleep came eventually, as it always did, like something returning from a short absence. There were nights when it did not come back. Not often. Not most nights. Not even for those most prone to it. The sick, the grieving, the troubled. Break time 5's the old, whose bodies had begun to lose their reliable relationship with darkness. But occasionally, and for everyone at some point, the second sleep did not arrive when expected, or arrived thin and insufficient, or was interrupted and did not return, and the person was left with the rest of the night stretched out ahead of them, longer than it should be, darker than the waking hour had been, requiring a response that the waking hour had not required. Medieval medicine had a word for this too. Vigilia, wakefulness, not insomnia in the modern sense. The modern usage carries an implication of pathology, of a body malfunctioning. Vigilia carried no such implication. It was a condition sometimes temporary, sometimes chronic, sometimes divine in origin, and sometimes digestive. Break. The physician's approach was practical. Examine what the person had eaten, assess the humoral balance, recommend adjustments. The religious approach was equally practical. If you cannot sleep, pray. Not as a cure, as an occupation. The night, unslept, must be filled with something, and prayer filled it as usefully as anything. The monk who lay awake in the dormitory after Matins, when second sleep refused to return, had options. He could pray mentally, running through the Psalms he knew by heart. He could meditate, the active form, Lectio Divina, the slow turning of a scripture passage over and over until it yielded something. He could simply lie still and wait, which was the form of discipline most resistant to distraction and most likely to eventually resolve in sleep. He could not light a candle. Break time 05's. He could not rise without potentially disturbing others. He was held in the dark by the rule, and by consideration, and by the simple fact that there was nowhere to go at 3 in the morning that was warmer than where he was. One winter, during his 5th year, the monk lay awake for 7 consecutive nights. Not fully awake, he slept in fragments, perhaps 2 hours here, an hour there, never the full second sleep, never the deep, slow descent into the body's preferred depth. He functioned, because the rule's structure functioned regardless of how the individual felt inside it. He sang the offices. He worked in the fields. He sat in the chapter house and listened to the abbot's address. He did all of this with a quality of attention that was slightly different from his normal attention. Thinner at the edges, less certain of itself. Break time 05s. As if the border between him and his surroundings had become more permeable than usual. On the 8th night, before Compline, the old monk with the scar, who had been watching him for most of the week without comment, the way someone watches a patient who has not yet identified themselves as a patient, stopped him in the cloister. He did not speak. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder for a moment and held it there. The weight of it was specific, not comforting in the sentimental sense, but present, the way one stone wall is present against another, holding each other up by simple adjacency. That night, after Matins, second sleep came before the bell for lauds. It was not the hand that did it. Or perhaps it was, in the same way that warmth sometimes comes from a source too small to account for it fully. Fury break time, 0.05s, which does not make the warmth less real or less necessary. The monk lay in his pallet in the dark, breathing slowly, falling. The dormitory breathed around him. The lamp burned. The cold pressed against the walls and held. He slept deeply and without dreams. Outside, the night continued past his, sleeping into the gray hours before dawn, covering the fields and the bare trees, and the road that led away from the monastery, toward the village, toward the world, quiet and indifferent and very old. The night, in the end, made no distinctions. It fell on the monastery and the castle, and the peasant's house, and the merchant's room above his shop, with exactly equal darkness. It gave each of them the same cold, the same bell, the same choice between two sleeps and the waking hour between them. Not justice. The castle was warm. Break time 05s. The peasant's house was not, and those were different nights in different bodies. But the structure of it, the fundamental architecture of dark and waking and dark again, that was shared, utterly, by every person who lay down in medieval England and closed their eyes. After many years, the monk lay in the dormitory on an autumn night and felt this. He was not thinking about equality. He was not thinking about anything in particular, which by now was easy. The years of practice had made a certain quality of mental quiet available to him, a stillness that was not the absence of thought, but the absence of the compulsion to continue it. He lay, and the room breathed around him, and he was simply present in the way he had learned to be present, without urgency, without commentary. Break time 05s. He thought of the blacksmith awake in his house 3 miles away. He did not know the blacksmith. He had spoken to no one from the village since his arrival. But he thought of him as a fact, the way you think of weather as a fact. Present, impersonal, the same for everyone. A man lying awake between his sleeps, in the dark, with the fire settling beside him, and the cold pressing in from the walls. The night finding his face the same way the night found the monk's face. The same quality of darkness, the same hour. All across the country, people awake in the interval, lying still, or praying, or speaking quietly in the dark to whoever was beside them. Hundreds of thousands of people in the waking hour. Each one separate, each one cold, each one in possession of the same dark. The night is always older than the people sleeping in it. Break time 05s. It has been here before any of them. It will be here after. It holds no particular brief for any individual's comfort or difficulty. And in this indifference, there is something that is not cruelty, something that is closer to the truth than comfort usually is. the honest weight of a world that exists outside of any single person's experience of it. The monk closed his eyes. The lamp at the end of the dormitory burned as it always burned, small and patient, the flame the same height it had been for hours, the oil diminishing at its own pace. Let this darkness come with you tonight. The old darkness, the shared darkness. You do not need to understand what it held. Only feel how long it has been there. The monk slept. The blacksmith's wife slept. The village slept beneath the same darkness, each body carrying the same cold. Break time 05s. Each mind moving through its own depths. And in the stone house beside the church, in the narrow building, with the single window facing east, another man lay in the waking hour between his sleeps and did not rest. Not because of fever or grief or the ordinary failure of the body's mechanism. Because in the morning, before the village woke, he would dress and light a candle and walk into the empty church and become, for an hour, something other than a man. And then the village would arrive, with everything it carried, and he would carry it with them. This is the day of a parish priest, one ordinary day in a life of ordinary days, in which nothing was ever ordinary. Scory 3, a day in the life. Priesty woke in the dark the way he always woke, not gradually, not reluctantly. Break time 05s. But with the direct and total attention of a man who had spent 20 years conditioning himself to be useful before anyone came to ask for him. The room was cold. The fire in the small hearth had burned to ash overnight, and the warmth he had fallen asleep with had followed the heat out through the thatch and the stone. And whatever gap remained between the door and its frame, which was a gap he had been meaning to repair since autumn. It was spring now. He would repair it in the autumn. He put his feet on the floor. The stone was cold in the specific way of stone that has been cold all night and makes no concession to the arrival of morning. Dense and flat. A cold that traveled immediately through the thin leather of his house shoes and settled in the arch of each foot. He had felt this every morning for 20 years. Break time 05s. He would feel it until the day he did not get up. He crossed to the window. Oiled cloth over a wooden frame. The light coming through it, not as light, but as a slightly less dark quality of the dark. He pressed the cloth aside with one finger. The sky to the east was barely beginning. Not pink, not orange. Just a shift in the gray, a thinning. The darkness becoming translucent along the horizon in a way that would take another hour to resolve into actual dawn. The village was still. He could see through the window's small opening the outline of the nearest house across the lane. A dark shape, no light, no smoke from the roof yet. Beyond it, the elm tree that had been in the churchyard since before anyone living could remember. Its winter branches just beginning to show the first swelling of buds. Approx 5s, visible only because he had been looking at this tree from this window for 20 years and knew its shape in every light. He dressed in the dark by memory, the habit first, the plain wool of a parish priest, nothing ornate, worn and well kept. The belt, the shoes properly, replacing the house shoes. He worked quietly, not because he would wake anyone. He lived alone, but because the dawn had a quality of stillness that he had learned not to interrupt unnecessarily, a quality that was easily disturbed and did not always return once disturbed. He built the fire from the banked embers, a small fire, enough for the morning, not enough to heat the room, because he would be in the church within the hour and the fire would be unnecessary. The kindling caught after the second attempt. The first flame was yellow and unsteady. Break time 05s. By the time he had fed it 3 pieces of the drier wood and added one of the heavier pieces above, it had committed to burning. He boiled water in the small iron pot. He had 1 cup of warmed water with a piece of hard bread, standing near the fire, looking at nothing in particular. The bread had been baked 3 days ago and was dry at the edges but not yet stale enough to require soaking. He ate it methodically, without particular pleasure or complaint, the way he ate most things, as a fact of the morning, necessary and therefore accepted. He thought about the day ahead, not anxiously. He had learned anxiety serves nothing, and had spent considerable effort over the years training himself out of it, with partial success. He thought practically. Mass at prime, the visit to old Robert, break time 05s, who was dying and had been dying since Epiphany, and whose family had sent word again yesterday that it was close. The boundary dispute between the 2 farms at the north end of the village, which he had been asked to mediate, and which he had putting off for a month, because both men were stubborn in different ways, and the mediation would require patience. He did not always have in abundance. He finished the bread. He set the cup on the table. He looked at the room for a moment before leaving it. The small table, the stool, the fire, the single shelf of books above the hearth. 6 books, all he owned, the psalter he had been given when he was ordained, the breviary, a small volume of sermons. 2 books he had borrowed from the cathedral library and had not returned in several years, and at this point was unlikely to return. Break, time 05s, and at the end of the shelf, a book of hours that had belonged to his predecessor, who had died in this same stone house, at this same table, having said his last morning mass and eaten his last cup of water in front of his last fire. The priest picked up the psalter. He put it in his robe. He opened the door. The cold air came in immediately, not aggressive, but present. Spring in England means the cold retreats but does not leave. It merely waits at a slight distance, ready to return whenever the sun fails to appear, which in England is often. He walked to the church. The church was always empty before Mass. This was one of the things he valued about it. Perhaps the thing he valued most, in the secret part of his thoughts, that he did not examine too closely. The church before Mass was the church as itself. Break, time equal 5s, restript of the congregation's heat and noise, and the particular quality of attention, or inattention, that a village brought to its worship. The empty church was something different. It was the building at its most essential, which was also the building at its most demanding. He had a key. He always had the key. Not a large key. The lock was simple iron, the mechanism worn smooth with use. The door opened with the particular sound of a large wooden door that has been opening in the same way for a long time. A slight resistance, a give, a low groan from the hinges that was not quite a complaint and not quite a welcome. He went in. The smell of the church in the morning was cold stone and old wood and beeswax candles burned down to their stubs, and the residue of incense from the previous day's Mass still present in the air. Very faint. Break time 05s, mere suggestion rather than a scent. The nave was dark. The east window, through which in an hour the first light would come, was dark glass and held nothing yet. He walked to the sacristy. This was the process he had completed nearly every day of his priesthood, so many times that the actions themselves had become a form of prayer, not the prayer of words, but the prayer of correct, careful movement, each action in its place. Nothing skipped. Nothing hurried, the alb first. The long white linen vestment that went over everything, covering the plain wool habit beneath, its texture softer than anything else he owned, its whiteness maintained by washing more carefully than he washed anything else. Then the amice, the rectangular linen at the neck and shoulders. Then the maniple at the left wrist, its brocade slightly worn at the fold. Break time, 05s. Then the stole, the long silk band that crossed from the left shoulder to the right hip, its weight familiar on his body, the weight of the office itself made tangible in fabric. Then the chasuble, the outermost vestment, green for ordinary time, a deep forest green, slightly faded at the edges from years of use, but still the green that meant ordinary time. The long season of growth between the church's great feasts. Each vestment had a prescribed prayer for its putting on. These he said quietly, from memory, without the book. He had said them thousands of times. They came now, the way walking came, without reference to the mechanism, only the movement. He lit the altar candles. 2. The flame of the taper touched the first wick, and it caught immediately. The second was slower, break time equal 5s, requiring a moment of held attention before it accepted the light. Then both burned with the steady, vertical flame of well-made candles in still air, and the altar was illuminated, and the gold of the cross behind it caught the light and sent it back changed. Not as a mirror sends light back, but with the warmth that gold gives to everything it touches. He placed the chalice on the altar, the paten beside it with the single unconsecrated host, the small cruets of wine and water to the right. He stood before the altar in the empty church. The candles moved slightly in a draught that came from somewhere he had never identified. A gap in the chancel wall, perhaps, or the door between the nave and the tower. He had been aware of this draught for 20 years. He had never found its source. Break time equals 05s. Every winter he checked all the possible places and found nothing. And every winter the candles in the chancel moved. He looked at the altar. He looked at what he had arranged on it. The church held the pre-dawn silence of a room, waiting to become something. Not empty, not full, but suspended between states, the way certain mornings are suspended between night and day before the sun decides. He lowered his head. He was not praying yet, formally. He was simply standing in the space he had been given, and finding himself small inside it, which was where he always needed to begin. They came in 1s and 2s, from the lane and from the field's edge, from the houses along the ridge and the farms below the stream, wiping their feet on the step, pulling hoods back in the doorway. Break time 05s, letting the smell of the outside morning in with them. Damp wool and wood smoke and the cold spring air, the smell of people who had risen early and had not yet been warmed by the day. The church filled to perhaps 40. Not all the village. The old men who could not walk the distance. The mothers with infants. The ones whose animals required tending before anything else could happen. But 40 was a reasonable count for a weekday mass in spring, when the plowing was not yet urgent, and the light was still short enough that the morning belonged to the church before it belonged to the field. He stood at the altar with his back to the congregation, as the rite required. This had been his life's daily act for 20 years. The Mass, every morning, in this building, facing east, the congregation behind him. Break time 05s. He did not see their faces during the canon, did not hear their individual voices during the responses. Just the collective murmur, the Latin he had taught them, syllable by syllable, over 2 decades, so that they could answer even if they did not understand, so that the call and response would be complete. They answered, and he continued, and together they built the structure of the rite the way a building is built. Not by one person, but by each part meeting the next correctly. He knew their voices, not individually during Mass, collectively, as a texture, but afterward, at the Ite Missa Est, when he turned and faced them, He knew each face by its position, by the quality of its attention, by whether it had been present last week and the week before. In the front left corner, the miller and his wife as always, a break time 05s. She was the more attentive of the two, her eyes on the altar from beginning to end, her responses just slightly ahead of the congregation's rhythm, as if she were pulling the others forward. He had never mentioned this to her. It would have embarrassed her. But he had noticed it for 15 years. In the center, halfway back, a small girl of perhaps 7 years, standing beside her grandmother, who was ancient and deaf and attended every Mass with the specific intensity of someone for whom Mass is the only event of the week worth the distance. The child did not fully understand what she was watching, but she watched it with the quality of attention that children sometimes bring to things that exceed their understanding. Total, unguarded, processing through senses rather than concepts. Her eyes moved when his hands moved. Break time equals 05s. When he elevated the host, she went very still. He saw this at the periphery of his attention. He continued the prayer. He did not perform for the child, or for the miller's wife, or for anyone in the room. He performed for the rite, which was the same argument the monastery had made about the Psalms. The act was the act, and the act's validity did not depend on what any individual within it felt about it on any given morning. He had days when he felt nothing at all at the altar, when the Latin moved through him without resonance, when the elevation was only a gesture, when the quiet after the consecration held nothing but quiet. He had other days when everything assembled. The light through the east window, the smell of incense, the voices of the people behind him, break. The weight of the chalice, and the assembly was precisely what the rite had always promised it could be. He could not predict which kind of day it would be. He had stopped trying. After the dismissal, the people left slowly, pausing at the door, speaking in the low voices that the church's exit always produced. Neither fully indoor voices nor fully outdoor ones. The sound of people recalibrating from one mode of attention to another. He stood at the altar and watched them go. The child passed with her grandmother, who was looking straight ahead, moving slowly toward the door. The child at the threshold turned and looked back at the altar once more. Then out into the morning, he began the preparation for Mass tomorrow. Robert was dying. He had been dying since Epiphany, which was approximately 3 months. Break time equals 05s. And before Epiphany, he had been ill since the previous harvest, which made it nearly 6 months in total. A long dying, the kind that exhausts everyone around the dying person before it exhausts the dying person. Because the body, even at the very end, is a more persistent thing than the patience of those watching it. The family had sent word. It was close. Today, perhaps. Tonight, the priest put on his outer cloak, the heavy wool for traveling, not the vestments, because he would revest at Robert's house for the last rites, and took the leather satchel from the sacristy. Oil, the small pyx with the reserved host, the stole, folded. He had made this journey many times, to many houses, and the preparation was always the same. Deliberate, without hurry, break time, 05s. Because hurry brought the wrong quality of attention to the thing he was going to do, and he had learned long ago that the dying needed a quality of attention that hurry made impossible. He walked north through the village. The lane was mud, as it had been since February, not the heavy mud of deep winter, frozen and then thawed to soup, but the spring mud, lighter, beginning to develop a crust at the edges where it had dried in yesterday's weak sun. His boots collected it in layers with each step, and each step became slightly heavier than the last. not impeding, simply present. Robert's farm was at the north edge of the village, past the well, past the dung heap, past the elm that marked the end of the maintained lane and the beginning of the field path. The house was low and dark from the outside, the thatch gray with age, break-time fives. The walls wattle and daub with 2 patches where the daub had been renewed recently. The new clay a different color from the old. Smoke from the roof. A dog chained at the side, which recognized the priest and did not bark. Robert's wife met him at the door. She was a stout woman, practical and exhausted, who had been caring for her husband for 6 months with the specific competence of someone who has no choice in the matter, and has therefore stopped assessing whether it is possible. She looked at the priest the way people look when they have been waiting. Then she stepped aside. The room smelled of illness. Not corruption, not that, not yet, but the sweet sore smell of a body consuming itself, of fever sweat and old straw, and the particular flatness of air that has not moved in too long. The fire was burning well. 05s. The room was warm by any ordinary measure, but Robert seemed cold. His wife had put everything available on him. 2 blankets, a sheepskin, his own cloak folded under his feet. He was still. The priest knelt beside the pallet. Robert's eyes opened. They were very clear. This sometimes happened near the end, the eyes becoming more precise as everything else slowed. He looked at the priest. His lips moved. The priest leaned down. "Is it finished?" Robert said. Not clearly. The words were frayed at the edges, but the priest had been doing this for 20 years and understood. "Not yet," the priest said. "We'll do it properly." He put on the stole. He took the oil from the satchel. He anointed the eyes, the ears, the nostrils, the lips, the hands. At the hands, the anointing of the palms, Robert's fingers closed briefly around his. Break time 05s. Just for a moment, the grip of a man who has been weakening for months, finding one last thing to hold. The priest did not move his hand. He finished the anointing and left his hand in the loosening grip and continued with the prayer. No words for this. Just his hand in that grip until it eased. He administered the viaticum. He said the final prayers. He stayed another quarter hour after they were finished, not because the rite required it, but because the family was watching from the corner of the room, with the particular helplessness of people, in the presence of something that requires no help, and his presence seemed to steady them. He left at mid-morning. Robert died before Vespers. The priest was in the churchyard when they came to tell him, break time 05s, walking the path between the graves in the way he sometimes walked when he needed to think without a direction. He stopped. He listened. He thanked the man who had brought the news. He stood still for a moment after the man left. Then he continued walking. The 2 men were waiting in the church porch when he returned from the churchyard. He had been expecting them for a month and had been hoping, each morning, that something would resolve the dispute before it required his involvement. Land disputes in a village of this size did not resolve themselves. He had been in this parish long enough to know that. 2 families, a boundary stone moved, or alleged to have been moved. 3 feet to the east, a strip of cultivated land perhaps 12 feet wide and 200 feet long, worth, in absolute terms, break time equals 05s, no more than a few pennies of annual yield. Worth, in the terms that actually governed these things, the terms of standing, of precedent, of what a man's father's father had worked. Worth everything. William stood on one side of the porch. Edmund stood on the other. Neither looked at each other. Both looked at the priest. He brought them into the nave. He did not sit. In 20 years of mediating disputes, He had learned that the physical position of authority mattered, and that sitting put him below the eye line of two standing farmers, which was not where he needed to be. He stood near the chancel step, where the altar candles were still burning from Mass, and he was taller than both of them, and the church was behind him, and this was enough. He listened to William. He listened to Edmund. Break. Fives. He asked questions in the specific way he had developed over years, not to gather information. He had most of the relevant information already, but to create the experience of being heard, which was what both men actually needed, and which neither would receive from the other without his facilitation. He asked William about the original boundary, its age, who had maintained it. He asked Edmund the same. He asked both of them about their father's understanding of the boundary and their father's. This took an hour. The dispute itself was not complicated. The boundary stone had been moved, not by either man, almost certainly, but by the frost heave of a particularly hard winter 7 years ago, which had shifted several markers in the north fields. Break. Time fives, a fact the priest knew because he had been asked to help re-establish 2 others that same year. The stone was where the frost had put it, not where human hands had placed it. Neither William nor Edmund had done anything wrong. The land was, effectively, 3 feet wide and 200 feet long of contested frost damage. He told them this. William's face changed. Resistance. The specific resistance of a man who has been righteously certain for months and is being asked to redirect that certainty toward a different target. It took a moment. Then something loosened in his jaw. Edmund looked at his boots. The priest made his ruling. The boundary would be re-established at the position indicated by the field map held at the cathedral, which both men agreed to accept before either knew what it said. Break time .05s. Because accepting the cathedral's authority was easier than accepting each other's. Edmund looked up at the priest, not at William. His face was the face of a man in whom something has shifted that he had not expected to shift. Not happy, not unhappy, simply changed, rearranged around a new fact. He nodded once. William also nodded. Then he looked at Edmund for the first time since entering the church. They left separately, through the same door. The priest stood in the empty nave for a moment after they had gone. The candles on the altar burned on, indifferent to all of it. The cold air from the north wall pressed steadily inward. Outside, he could hear the village sounds resuming. A cartwheel, a voice calling across a lane, a door. He thought of Robert's hand. He thought of the child at Mass, turning to look back at the altar. Break time 05s. He gathered nothing from either thought. He simply held them for a moment, and then let them be part of the day, which was what they were. He ate alone. He had always eaten alone, since his ordination, since the day he arrived in this parish, and the outgoing priest, old Father Thomas, who was 60 and looked 80, and could no longer make the distance to the outlying farms, had handed him the key and the satchel and the list of the most demanding parishioners. Written in a handwriting that had begun to go sideways and was still perfectly legible, and had walked to his brother's house in the next village to spend whatever was left of his life somewhere warm. Alone meant the table in the stone house, 1 cup, 1 bowl, 1 knife. Not loneliness. The word required something he did not have. Break time 05s, which was the expectation of company that was then unfulfilled. He had never had that expectation, and so had no particular consciousness of the aloneness. It was simply the shape of his days, and the shape of his days was simply the shape of his life, which he had not chosen in every particular, but had chosen in the essential particular, which was enough. He ate salt fish, which he ate most days during Lent, and had the taste of something that had been asleep. Bitter earth, mineral, the sea preserved in salt until the sea was unrecognizable but still present. He ate a piece of the same hard bread from the morning. He ate a cold leek from yesterday's pottage, which had improved overnight and would have been better hot, but he did not reheat it because the fire was low and the effort exceeded the return. Break time. He ate with the quality of attention he brought to everything, not rapturous, not inattentive, simply present with the meal as a fact of the day. One more fact, neither less important than the others nor more. The house was quiet. Outside, the village sounds were muted at this hour. The midday pause when people were eating and the morning's urgency had resolved into the slower tempo of afternoon. A crow somewhere on the roof, the sound of the stream at the bottom of the lane, which he could hear on still days when the wind was from the south. He thought about Robert's funeral. 3 days, probably. Time for the family to make the arrangements. Time for him to prepare the words. Time for the village to do what villages did when someone who had been among them for 63 years was suddenly absent. The grave was already dug. Break time 05s. He had had the sexton do it last week, which had felt presumptuous and had been practically correct, because the ground was still cold and a grave dug in a hurry was not dug as carefully as a grave dug in advance. He thought about what he would say at the Mass of the Dead, not the prescribed words, those he knew without thinking. The words of his own, the specific words that would be true about Robert, the things about this particular man that mattered to the people who had known him, and that no liturgy, however ancient, had been written to cover. This was the part of his work he found most difficult and most necessary, finding the true particular thing inside the general framework and saying it plainly, without either embellishment or reserve. He finished the fish. He put the bowl on the shelf. Break time 05s. He sat for a moment at the table with his hands flat on its surface. The table was old wood, rough under the palms, worn smooth only in the center where it had been used most. He could feel the grain beneath his hands, the slight ridges, the particular roughness of wood that has been in use long enough to have taken on the qualities of the space it occupies. His predecessor had eaten at this table. For 30 years, every midday, alone, one life and then another in the same shape. He rose. He put on the outer cloak. He went back to work. The afternoon light in England in spring fails earlier than expected. It is a particular quality of late afternoon at this latitude. The sun angling low and gold, and then, without the dramatic announcement of southern dusk, simply retreating, as if it had remembered something and turned back. Break time 05s. One moment there is still warmth in the light. The next, the warmth is gone and only the light remains. And then the light too begins its careful withdrawal, leaving the world in a gray that is neither dark nor bright, that seems to extend longer than it should, filling the gap between the sun's departure and the night's arrival with a long, non-committal dusk. He rang the bell for vespers himself. There was no one else. The sexton was old and the cantor was the miller's wife, who was not officially a cantor but whose voice carried the congregation when the priest's voice needed to carry the office, and who arrived for vespers most evenings with the quiet reliability of a woman who has made a private decision about her spiritual practice and does not require public recognition of it. She arrived tonight while the bell was still ringing, for break time equal. 05's ought slipping through the side door with the specific economy of movement of someone who has been doing this for years and has found the most efficient path from the lane to the choir. He acknowledged her with a nod. She nodded back. This was the extent of their communication before the office. It was sufficient. The congregation for Vespers was smaller than Mass. Perhaps 20. On an ordinary evening, fewer in the summer when the light lasted and the fields kept them, more in winter when the dark came early and the church was warmer than it seemed from outside. Tonight there were 23 people, which was neither fewer nor more than expected, and which was, after 20 years, simply the number that Vespers had. He led the office from the altar. The psalms of Vespers were different from the psalms of the morning office. Older in feel, break time zo fives, somehow, even though they were the same psalms, the same words. Something about the failing light changed them. The Magnificat in particular, which came near the end of the office, had a quality at this hour that the same text did not have at prime. It was slower, more resolved, the particular weight of a text sung at the close of the day instead of the beginning of it. After the final blessing, the congregations dispersed in the usual way. The young quickly, the old slowly, the miller's wife last, who sometimes stayed to bank the candles and rearrange whatever the congregation had disarranged in the course of the evening. Tonight there was a woman who had not left. She was perhaps 30, sitting near the back, in the corner, near the north pillar, where the light fell only obliquely, and her face was partly in shadow. Break time, 05s. He knew her, everyone in the parish, and knew that her husband had been away since autumn on business for the manor lord, and that the uncertainty of when he would return had compacted into something she carried in her shoulders. In the way, she sat in the pew with her hands in her lap and did not move to leave. He walked to her. He sat down in the pew beside her, which was irregular and which he did not care about. He did not say anything immediately. The church held the quality of a room after the last person has spoken. The silence that is the reverse image of the sound that preceded it, holding the shape of what was said. She said, "I don't know if he's coming back," he said. "I know, not more, not less." The two words said without pretense of having an answer that would help. Break time 05s. Said with the only honesty available, the honest acknowledgement of her uncertainty and his own inability to resolve it, which was not what comfort usually looked like, but was, tonight, what she needed. She looked at the altar. The candles were burning down now, the flame slightly lower than at the start of the office, the wax pooling at the base. She sat with this for a moment. Then she rose. She did not thank him. She walked to the door and opened it, and the evening air came in briefly, carrying the smell of cold grass and distant wood smoke, and then the door closed and she was gone. He sat alone in the church. The candles burned. The cold from the walls accumulated slowly, as it always did after the body heat of the congregation had faded. Tomorrow he would say Mass again. He returned to the stone house at the close of the day. Breaks time 5s. Not late, the village was still active when he came in. The lane not fully dark, a few voices from the nearest houses, the smell of evening fires beginning. He opened the door of the stone house, and the cold interior received him, and he went inside and closed the door, and that was the day done. He built up the fire properly. Not the small morning fire, the real fire, the one that would burn through the evening and bank overnight, and give the cold something to push against. He fed it steadily until it was committed to its own burning, and then he pulled the stool to the hearth and sat. He was tired. Not broken, the particular tiredness of a man whose day has been full of the right things rather than the wrong ones. His feet ached from the mud of the Northfield path. His shoulders held the residue of the morning's mass. Break time. Fives. The specific fatigue of sustained attention carried in the body rather than the mind. His voice had the slight roughness that an evening of singing always left, which he had long ago learned to read not as damage but as use. He sat and let the fire warm him, which it did, slowly and without apology, the way a good fire warms. Not all at once. Not from the surface inward, but from the blood outward. The whole body converting the heat into something sustainable. He thought about the day, not in order. The mind does not review a day in order, but in pieces. Robert's hands, the child at Mass, Edmund's face when something in him shifted, the woman in the pew at Vespers who had said what she said and had not apologized for saying it, the bread at midday, the crack in the east window that needed caulking before next winter. Break. Time 05s. The boundary stone, moved by frost, belonging to neither man. He thought about whether he had done any of it well. Not the right. The right was the right, and he could assess that. The human parts. The quality of his attention at Robert's deathbed, which had been good, he thought. The mediation, which had been adequate. The woman at Vespers, to whom he had said 2 words, and those 2 words had been the right ones, only by accident, because he had not known what to say, and had therefore said the least wrong thing. This was the whole of it. Not mastery, not vision. A man doing his best in the hours he was given, with the tools he had, for the people who came to him, and not always succeeding, and returning to the same building the next morning to try again. A village carries its weight in silence. Break time 5s. The priest who carries it rarely speaks of it, which does not mean it is not heavy. That weight had lived in this stone house for as long as the house had stood. It had lived in his predecessor, and in his predecessor before that, each man taking it up at ordination and setting it down only at death, not because they were remarkable men, but because the task required a continuous human presence, and they were the presence available. He looked at the fire. He was not unhappy. He was not particularly happy. He was here, in this room at the end of this day, warm now, with the psalter in his robe and the key to the church in his pocket, and 20 years of mornings behind him, and more mornings ahead. Let this priest come with you into the dark tonight. Not his faith, not his certainty, only his presence, at the door, at the altar, beside the pallet in the cold house at the north end of the village. Only the simple fact of a man who kept showing up.